gathering them together like this actually creates a risk environment much greater.
That's right. And with chronic wasting disease, you can think of it like any disease, two ways. There's two kinds of risks, I should say. One is the risk that it will get to the feed grounds. It's not there now. Hopefully it never gets there. But if we don't think proactively about this and realize that there's a real potential for that to happen, then we won't do some things that we should do to mitigate the consequences.
And let's talk proactively. What are the things you can do?
Well, let me mention the other risk.
Sure.
The other risk is if it gets there, then how severe will the problem be? In other words, what is the amplification rate of the disease? What percentage of the population will become infected? And we know from other diseases that when animals are dispersed and at lower density on the range and living in healthy conditions, not crowded conditions, will have lower disease prevalence.
Right.
On feed grounds, it's a whole different ballgame.
And we've seen that with brucellosis.
Right, and that's why it's maintained with brucellosis.
Okay, so let's talk about solutions. I mean, I know there are vaccinations that people have tried. Are there various other ways that you might control this disease besides just shutting down the feed ground?
Well, there is no vaccination for chronic wasting disease. Obviously, that's been tried for many years by Wyoming Game and Fish Department on feed grounds with brucellosis.
Right.
But with chronic wasting disease, there is nothing out there. There's no silver bullet. There's no way to vaccinate to prevent it. There's no cure for it once the animal has it, and it's 100% fatal. Okay. And most importantly, these prions, when they're shed in the environment, survive a long, long time. They're not degraded by heat, by cold, even by chemicals, UV light, and obviously decontaminating an area the size of the elk refuge is not realistic even if chemicals worked.
So pretty easy for other animals to pick up those prions
That's
and
right.
be infected.
And they may well accumulate. So over time the disease could become worse because of the accumulation of these contaminated environments.
Yeah. So is the only solution, and I don't know if you're advocating it or not, to actually shut down the feed ground?
Well, it's not something that anyone would hear out of my mouth for the first time. And there's many, many other scientists, veterinarians, even policymakers that realize and have advocated that we need to phase out of feed grounds.
And there's plenty of people saying, don't do it, don't do it.
Absolutely. There's my experience in the last 3 decades, 25% of the public think feed grounds are breeding grounds for disease and need to be phased out. Another 25% think they're the best thing since sliced bread and they should go on forever. But my book, Where Elk Roam, is really written for that other 50%. Mm-hmm. They're either uninformed, they're misinformed, they're confused, and I'm trying to engage more people in the conversation and the conservation of this elk herd.
And you've given us pretty good arguments for why you might want to shut them down. Who are the opponents of shutting them down? What are the values they're trying to protect?
Well, I can't really speak for other people because there not only could be, there are different reasons. But in general, people are used to having all of these elk available. Right. It's good for hunting, it's good for business, the business community, and it's tradition. Yep. It's part of the culture of Jackson Hole.
Okay. So let's now talk a little bit about how you came to write this book, and we have to give a little more of your personal history to do this, and because it really predates your time at the elk refuge. You spent some time in my part of the country on the Wind River Indian Reservation.
Yeah.
That was a job you had before you moved to the elk refuge, and a book came out of that as well.
It did. I was writing Wildlife on the Wind about 25 years. I started to write that about 25 years after I left the Wind River Reservation. Okay. I was there from 1978 to 82. I was the first wildlife biologist to work on the reservation at the request of the Shoshone and Arapaho tribes to help them gather the technical data so they could make decisions to conserve their wildlife and restore their wildlife, which was very depleted. And they had inherited depleted wildlife.
And that was a political battle. I was here covering that, so I know.
Yeah, and yet, those 4 years were probably the most rewarding years of my career because such amazing recovery of wildlife came out of that. It's really a landmark conservation effort, and I really enjoyed working with the people.
And it actually occurred after you left. You were a little frustrated during your time on the reservation because a game code was not passed. There was a lot of political infighting about it, and ultimately other biologists like Dick Baldus and others who remained after you saw that finally come to fruition.
That's right, and as a technical person gathering the first population and habitat information, working with the tribes on a game code, I was just providing a resource that they needed.
Right.
Ultimately, all the credit goes to the Shoshone and Arapaho people. It's their wildlife, it's their land, and they are responsible for what happened there, and they should be honored for it, I thought, and that's why I wanted to write the book.
And you've come out with 2 books fairly quickly in succession, I'll say, as a frustrated writer myself. It's amazing how quickly, and I think that may have something to do with the fact that you're no longer working as a biologist with Fish and Wildlife Service.
That's right. I retired way back in April of 2004.
We're all jealous.
My first book came out that fall, and then I've had Wildlife on the Wind and Where Chrome since then, so this is my 3rd book.
Okay.
And this is what I knew I wanted to do. My passion is to conserve wildlife and wildlands, and the best way I think I can do that is to write for a general audience about that, and then do a lot of speaking. I do a lot of speaking engagements.
And you obviously were taking really good notes during these periods of your life, because these books are chock full of fact and material that gives you a lot of the detail of your experience and of the science involved.
My wife accuses me of being a pack rat.
Okay.
But I've always been that way. I've always kept journals, I've kept notes, newspaper, I have files of newspaper clippings, everything. And thank goodness I did that. I guess somewhere deep down inside I knew I was going to be a writer full-time in the future. So yeah, it's really important to have that kind of material to work from.
More projects ahead? Again, you have the freedom now to write, travel, talk, do all the things that you're doing. I know you're keeping very busy.
Right.
You got plans for more books?
Yeah, on January and February I had a little time while I was waiting for the next set of proofs on this last book to come back, and I roughed out a new book.
Okay.
And that one's going to be on natural history and conservation of mountain goats.
Okay. Let's come back here at the end and talk a little bit more about elk and about what we might see if one were to shut down the feed grounds. I don't know if you'd shut down the elk refuge, but if you stopped feeding there, what would the effect be on the elk? Would they begin dispersing, and what would we expect?
Well, I don't think anybody can say for sure. I mean, they're animals with minds of their own, and they behave largely as herds, but they're individuals too. And I have some ideas about how the elk will behave afterwards. And at first, obviously, some of those elk are 20 years old, and they're going to hone right in on where they got fed last winter.
Sure.
So the first winter will be different than the second winter or the third winter. But overall, I mean, the goal here is to have a healthy herd that's sustainable into the future for all of the important biological and ecological, as well as social and economic reasons that they're there.
Okay.
And it won't be easy to do this, and yet just 2 months ago, an appellate court ruling mandated that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service develop a plan to phase out feed grounds, because what they're doing is inconsistent with the mission of the National Wildlife Refuge System Improvement Act.
And might we see some of the famed long ago migrations that used to take place, where elk used to go from Grand Teton all the way down to the Red Desert? Might those come back? Is
kind of like the pronghorn migration out of Jackson
Very
Hole.
much like it. Same
and
route.
that's the same route that most of those elk took historically.
Right.
Most of those elk didn't stay in Jackson Hole for very obvious reasons. Why stay in the Snow Bowl when you can go down to the Red Desert or Little Colorado Desert where it's windblown and you can get forage more easily? But there are so many obstacles now. I write about it in the book.
Right.
I talk about how that could be recreated. The last chapter is titled Prescription for Progress. But I also talk about an alternative to accomplishing what I would like to see happen there without restoring those migrations.
What we're going to let people do is get the book, read that prescription for the future, and make their own conclusions. Thanks
Great.
very much, Bruce.
Thank you.
Yeah.